Hola! Today we're going to talk about the poetry of Ngora and Quevedo, two of the most important poets from the 17th century or part of the golden age of Spanish literature. Before knowing anything else, I asked you to complete this quiz to see if you had any ideas or guesses about these questions. So what do you think? Calderón de la Barca is considered the author that finishes the Spanish Golden Age. That's true. And it is also true that he depicted, probably better than anybody else, the dissolution of the Baroque time period. He also wrote La vida es sueño, which we could say it's like the 17th century version of the movie Inception, where this king, who is the main character, cannot distinguish at one point what's real life and what's dream. For number 4, Cervantes introduced very many details in Don Quixote, but never autobiographical elements. That's false, because he did introduce autobiographical elements at some point. He also wrote La Numancia, which was the first novel that he published when he was about to drop literature because he couldn't make a living out of it. And Don Quixote's author was Cervantes, of course. For number 7, it's false because Góngora was actually quite good at experimenting with language, and he really enjoyed it. This is false because he did use quite often the Greek and Roman mythology in his poems. For number 9, that's absolutely false because it's not that they hated each other, but it's more that Quevedo enjoyed attacking Góngora for his life choices and his style in poetry. Quevedo is not the master of culturalism, he's the master of conceptism. Sancho Panza serves Don Quixote. He's a faithful squire, but he's not very educated. He's introduced as a peasant who doesn't really know much about life, but that's more like at the beginning. We will get to see more of him when we get to see Don Quixote. The Baroque time period was indeed a very creative and prolific era, but also filled with disillusion. During this time, El ingenioso hidalgo Don Quixote de la Mancha was published, and it is understood as a dialogue between idealism and realism. Don Quixote is also the representation of the outsider, the person that was never understood by his contemporaries, and as we have mentioned before, the Spanish Baroque period is also called the Golden Age. Well, how did you do? Together with this information, we need to talk about some of the most important themes in Baroque poetry. Some of them you already know, like Carpe Diem, enjoy the day, seize the day, and Tempus Fugit, time flies. But this time, Tempus Fugit is combined with this idea of death. What does that mean? That it's this concept about time flying, and the only thing it leads you to, it's to death. Okay? These two themes are combined with an important social criticism, and this aim for the aesthetic, for the beauty of the poem in form and content. And this concept, very popular in Baroque type of art, which is the concept of chiaroscuro, the contrast between light and dark, that applied to literature means the contrast between extremes, basically. About our two authors, Góngora and Quevedo, let's start with Góngora, who was born in Córdoba. He was also the son of a judge, and he studied in Salamanca. And he was a very quiet type of person. He liked to enjoy playing cards and attending to plays and musicals in his hometown. He was also ordained a priest, And he's known for his lighter, but basically for his more intense type of works. And he never published while he was alive. His style is known as gongorismo, gongorism, or quarteranism. This type of movement is inspired in the Latin type of grammar and syntax. So they use a little bit of complex imagery, sometimes too complex for the general reader. They also introduced mythological elements, so not everyone is familiarized with that. And basically they turn an uncomplicated story into something obscure. A little bit more about culturalism. It's this idea to impress, to impact the reader and his senses with the use of a culture lexicon. So because of that, they are more worried about the form. For example, to say the word lips, they would use the metaphor doors of rubies. He is known for his brilliant but also bitterly satiric account. About his style, he also never published while he was alive, but he was quite prolific, and his style is known as conceptism, that we will describe in a minute. And basically his works can be divided into three different. His style, he also never published while he was alive, and his way of writing is called conceptism, the use of double meaning that we are going to describe more in detail in a minute. His works can also be divided into three different main groups: the philosophical moral type of poetry, where he expresses his pessimism and disillusioned vision of the world and life in general. What we could say, number two, the regular love poetry. And finally, what he's best known for, the satirist burlesque type of poetry, since he is known as the master of deformation and caricature. About conceptism, the idea is to appeal to the intelligence of the reader, so that's why they use plain words and antitheses and paradoxes and hyperboles. The idea is that everything means something else, apart from the more obvious type of meaning. That way, the poets are more worried about the content than they are about the form. In connection to that, we can see these examples of how their styles force them or made them to attack each other. For example, this one is called Against Ngora, which, if you read, can tell you that probably Quevedo wrote it, and that he was trying to express how Góngora's poetry is too pompous and the words that he used were too complicated for the general public to understand. On the other hand, we have this one called To Don Francisco de Quevedo, where this poem that is attributed to Góngora says that the poet in line 2 was in pilgrim spirits, making reference to the spirit as in alcohol, and that you could sterilize the bloodiest wound in line 4. Okay, so he's calling him a drunkard, but using not so obvious type of meanings. So the fight between the two of them is very well known, and their styles were very different. So let's see a few more examples of their poetry. This beautiful poem by Góngora called Concerning the Deceptive Brevity of Life. As you can imagine, the theme is Tempus Fugit, time flies. Then he has mythological allusions in this one called To Jupiter. But then Quevedo had this poem, for example, on the left, called to Apollo chasing Daphne, we already know what the story is about because of Garcilaso. But then what Quevedo does is, if you read the poem more in detail, it's that he's calling her, a nymph, referring to the word nymphomaniac, and that basically she is a prostitute and you can buy her love whenever you want. The two poems are quite harsh with the character of Daphne. So you can see the two of them had different approaches with mythology, for example. Then we have this poem, very well known in the Spanish, by the Spanish people, called To a Man with a Big Nose. But then you can see in examples like these, love constant beyond death, how bright he was, how beautiful type of poetry he could write, how sensitive he was to be able to write something like that. And then this aphorismo that I tried to translate for you, which says, yesterday is gone, tomorrow has not arrived. Today is going without any stops. I am one was, and one to be, and one is tired. I find this absolutely magnificent. Okay, so for these two poets, I prepared a group work analysis of two of the most important poems by these two authors. The first one, Mientras por competir con tu cabello, by Ngora. So you will have to find why this poem is a poem based in the Gongorism type of style. And in the other one, you will have to find out all the double meanings expressed by the writer. So just basically things that every word means something else. So what's that something else? Okay, and that's for me. That's all for me from now. And as usual, thank you.